a physicist, got her diploma in physics in Bochum.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is where you.
No, in Tübingen, but that's fine. Just go ahead.
Okay. She had since then a PhD in
Bochum.
And she worked in Israel with Moshe Abeles. She also held a position in the Riken Institute in Japan for 5 years. And she also has been in Munich from 2011. So I think as an introduction that for many, many years we're gathering data from neural activity and more data, but fewer and fewer people actually are thinking what to do with it. And Sonia has been a pioneer in examining the spike trains and trying to make sense out of it. So I don't want to talk more. It's all yours. Go ahead. Thank you, Sonia.
Thanks. And can you maybe switch off the front slide? Yes. That is could be seen a bit better. So thanks. I need to correct. Is something wrong? I need to correct Pedro a little bit. So people are, of course, looking at massively parallel spike trains and so on, and nowadays are using PZA and submanifolds of firing rates and so on. But in the sense, this is not focusing on timing. This is firing rate detection. And here I want to focus a little bit on a different direction, which is, I think, more close to what is requested to everyday's behavior. And so I will report basically on 2 papers. One is not even published or submitted. This is done mainly by Alessandra Stella, who's a very talented PhD. No, she is a postdoc. Unfortunately, she will go back to Turin. And we are analyzing Alexa Riles data. And I will also talk a bit about modeling. So if you think about natural behavior, this is typically dynamic and fast. Yeah. So in the range of if you do free viewing, you have a sequence of circadian fixation within 250 milliseconds. And if you calculate this, how many spikes you probably have within each cortical stage, here following the idea of Thorpe, you are on the range of about 1 spike per area. So there is not much to integrate. And so the hypothesis I'm following is neurons coordinate their activities on short timescales in a dynamic fashion. On the other hand, if you think of cortical connectivity, there is a high density of neurons in the order of, on average, 40,000 neurons per cubic millimeter, and each neuron has about 10 to 20,000 synapses. And an individual neuron is projecting to about the same number, to about 10,000 neurons. And on the other hand, each neuron is receiving about 10,000 inputs or connections. So if you consider this, then you end up with a high convergence and a high divergence in the network. And this asks for network processing. And the hypothesis, to put the hypothesis a bit further, I made this drawing that you get an idea about how I'm thinking. So the idea is that during, so to say, a certain behavior, that, so to say, assume that, so to say, a subset of neurons is activated in different subsets of neurons as it goes by time. So I would consider something like this, who is active these together and then following up those and then those, that this would be a cell assembly as proposed by Hebb. in 1949. He was basically one of the first who proposed this idea of assemblies of groups of neurons which analyze, which compute together. And this must then be somehow visible somehow in this interaction of the neurons must be visible by correlations in some sense in their activities. So one idea how this activity could look like of these neurons would be that if this group is active, for example, the neurons, if you were able to record many neurons of these respective groups, that then the first group would be synchronously active, and then the next, and then the next, and so on. But typically, what we also have to think and consider more and more is that there is a subsampling going on, likely, yeah, and this will come back in a minute, so that you, from this sequence of synchronous activity, maybe just see a signature of a few neurons exhibiting spatial temporal spike patterns. And if this network is in the same way is activated again, we will see this a very similar pattern with maybe some small temporal jitter. Again, I'm talking here about millisecond precision of this delta, these intervals between the spikes, and maybe a temporal jitter of each spike, maybe of up to 5 milliseconds. So this is the same thing shown again. In a way, this is what we want to detect. And one point I want to make is that also the method we are applying to parallel data is that there are in between other spikes. Yeah. So it's not restricted to only the spikes we observe, but there are spikes in between, which are then not so relevant for us. We are just interested in such sequences of spikes and want to see whether they occur significantly beyond firing rates, and are they related somehow to behavior, and how do they look like. And so this is one of the data sets we analyzed for such patterns. This is the so-called bridge to grasp experiment, which Alexa Rile performed many years ago together with Thomas Roger at the CNRS in Marseille. And what you can see here is we have here about 100 simultaneously recorded neurons, recorded with a Utah array of 10 by 10 electrodes in the motor cortex. And the monkey had to perform a task where he first indicated that he is ready to participate. Then he will get a cue, which type of movement he has to perform later on. And then he will get a go signal. These are artifacts, by the way. And what you see here with these increases here is typically when somehow our movement is being done. So what you can see already from this display of many neurons as a function of time, it's inhomogeneous across the neurons. They are non-stationary in time, and not all neurons are doing the same thing. And this is all relevant and makes analysis also quite complicated. Now, as I just said, the challenge for the analysis is, in particular for spatial temporal patterns, it's already a challenge if you want to look at synchrony or spike correlation in such what I called for some time massively parallel data, let's say 100 or more. It's already a challenge, yeah. But then going to spatial temporal patterns, this was much more difficult, because you have a huge combinatorial explosion of parameters if you had n neurons and you would only look for synchrony, then you had this equation without this k. Yeah, but now, so 2 to the power of 100 is already quite a bit. And then to the power of k, which is, so to say, a duration of the pattern. This is what so to say, is increasing the combinatorics yet again. You have to deal somehow with it and try not to detect false positives or yeah. So you have a massive multiple statistical testing problem. And so you cannot just test pattern by pattern, then you would have a lot of false positives. And you can imagine that that you also have a lot of chance patterns. So you need to somehow fish out the ones which are relevant. And so we worked out this method, the spade, for, I would say now 10 years. We started out with synchrony and then extended it at some point for spatial temporal patterns. And the step, as I said, from synchrony to spatial temporal was quite considerable, but we learned how we have to deal with it. And as before, we used also here for the counting of patterns, we used frequent item set mining, which makes the counting much more efficient. And then after the counting, we start, so to say, with the statistics. So here again, I want to briefly illustrate the method. So if we have parallel spike data, what we do with them is we bin the time axis in some small bins, let's say 5 milliseconds. We clip the contents to 1 if there is 1 or more spikes. Then we have a binary sequence, so to say. Then we apply on this parallel data this frequent item set mining, which we modified such that we can count these patterns. Typically, this is something which is used in supermarket basket analysis, because they want to know what is being bought often together. And then I thought, bought together, fire together. Maybe this we can use in such a way, which we did. Then we get our pattern counts. And now the question is, how do we deal with this massive multiple testing? And we found a way of, so to say, counting data not individually, but create what we call a pattern spectrum. So what we do here is to define, let's say, voxels in which we count patterns of the same signature. Signature is defined as the same size, meaning the same number of neurons involved, the same number of occurrence of the pattern, and the same duration. Yeah? These we pool, so to say, in such a pattern spectrum, which we call them, such that we have reduced a lot, so to say, the dimensionality, such that we have such a 3D thing where we have in each of these boxes, we have a count of patterns of this signature. And the next step now is to make a statistics to see whether the contents of such a voxel is beyond chance. And so this we do by this part here. So what we do is this, you can't treat this analytically, this doesn't work. So what we started to do is to use surrogate data, meaning what we do, we destroy intentionally the correlation in this data by creating surrogate data, by modifying the data that exists. At the beginning, we used what we call dithering, which is displacing each individual spike by a certain amount. Now we use a method which is, so to say, shifting the spike trends against each other. Yeah. which was proposed by Gordon Pieper, and I can elaborate on this why this is better, but anyway, so we destroy the correlation and generate a surrogate data, which has approximately the same features as the original one. The firing rates are quite similar, the interspike interval is similar, and so on. And now we analyze these data sets in the very same way as we did above. Yeah, see, this is very identical. And then we calculate from the pattern counts of this independent data. We calculate, so to say, their spectrum. And from this, we can derive a p-value spectrum with which we compare the original counts to see which ones are occurring more often than we would expect by the firing rate. And then from this, we can filter out, so to say, the patterns which are candidates, and then we get significant spatial temporal patterns. You don't have to understand this, but just believe me, just believe me that, that this is extracting only significant data. And of course, we do a multiple testing correction and so on. So we tested this method with artificially generated model data, yeah, stochastic processes and so on, which can all be seen in this paper here, which appeared last year in eNeuro. So now I want to come to the point to now what do we do with real data? And this is now the experimental protocol of the data I showed you before already. Monkey gets a signal. No, he initiates the trial. Then he gets, so to say, a signal by a yellow LED to attract his attention. Then he gets a cue of either these two LEDs lighted or these two. This indicates to him later on you have to make a precision grip or a side grip. And then he has to wait for 1,000 milliseconds, and then he gets the go signal, which is yet another part of the information how he has to make this grip. So you see here there are two LEDs now in this orientation switched on, or this. And this means with a high force or with a low force. And then he is reaching the object. So this is the time, reaction time, reaching the object, pulling it with the according fingers and force, and then he gets reward. So what we did is to, so to say, account for the time, the dynamics. Of course, I would have liked to do this in a time-resolved manner, but this is much too expensive. You cannot do this in terms of numerical effort. Instead, this thing is somehow not stable. Yeah. So, so we split the data into epochs of 500 milliseconds around different behaviorally relevant epochs. You see here we have 6 here in different periods. So we have 4 trial types, and where we have these different kind of grip types. And then within this, we have 6 epochs, which we collect across the trial types of the same kind. So we have in total 4 times 6 data sets per session, which we analyze separately. And we have 2 monkeys of 10 sessions. This is the data you will then see. Aha, and the recording is done by a Utah array of 10 by 10 electrodes in motor cortex. Now, we found spatiotemporal patterns. I was not sure whether we will find spatiotemporal patterns. Yeah. So yeah, we found spatiotemporal patterns. And what you see now here is one monkey and the other monkey in 10 data sets. And you see in yellow the units involved in patterns. So there are not so many involved in patterns.
Yeah, this is kind of.
Yeah.
I know that statistics required to compare to a surrogate, in this case random. How much of these patterns are above chance?
I will come to this.
Okay.
I will come to this. This is now only, so to say, the neurons involved in patterns, in significant patterns. And you see that in all but one data set, we have neurons involved in patterns, about 5 to 10% in the different monkeys. Yeah. And now you see here other overall statistics. I will come back to the details of the patterns. You will see patterns. Just to see how this is distributed across the behavioral parts of the experiment in monkey N, in monkey L. You see the different trial types. So we have more or less all over in the experiment these patterns occurring. The size of the patterns. Yeah. Now, how many neurons are involved in a pattern? I need to add that we did not consider neurons or spikes which repeat within the same spike train, for the reason that these spike trains are typically relatively regular. So we restricted us only to at most one spike per neuron. And then we found that we have typically up to 2 to 5, or here up to 6 neurons in a pattern. When we looked at synchronous patterns, this was at most 3 or so. So this is more. I don't know if I should find this a lot or not, but here it comes into play already, that what I wanted to say before. We are downsampling the network a lot. We are only looking through 100 holes onto about 1 neuron at a time, or maybe a little bit more. But we have a lot of neurons in this network. Yeah. So in principle,
and you didn't mention that this dimension of 4 by 4 millimeters. Yeah.
Sorry.
So if you consider this in relation to the particle microscope, this is between the electrodes. Yeah, it's outside the local connection.
And it's more or less in one plane. Yeah, it's not going across layers.
Yeah, but means the table are okay. Population coding, your globulins with the same 100 neurons were able to precisely determine the direction of the movement.
By firing rates.
By firing rates. So it seems that with the firing rate, you can get more information than with this spatial temporal.
Maybe. Maybe. What should I say now?
No. My thought is, why will buy with the spatial temporal patterns that will not buy by rate?
This is a different spatial range. From just a single neuron.
Right.
At a time.
At a time, or maybe nearby neurons that have the same tuning. These neurons, because they are so far apart, which have completely different tuning. Or even other body parts, it's like 4 millimeters distance. Yeah. So this tuning, this tuning, is a property that these neurons also have in addition. It's not analyzed here, but you would expect they have some.
Yeah.
So the point is that even while it looks like very few patterns appear, if you take into account a larger amount of cortex, these are really maybe hundreds of thousands patterns across the.
Yes. This is what I'm saying implicitly. I cannot prove it, but this is what I'm basically saying. Yeah. I will come back to this also with some visualization. Maybe then we can discuss this again. I would suggest. And just to finish this slide here, the pattern duration is distributed across from synchronous to about 60 milliseconds because we limited it to 60 milliseconds. Now I want to show you how these patterns typically look like. Yeah. So first I need to explain this, and then it will be an animation. So this is now one of these epochs of 500 milliseconds, which we have in several trials and which we analyze together. What you see here is the neurons involved in this data set in all the different behavioral epochs. Yeah. You can see here the behavioral condition in which we found this, and here is the trial type. And here you will then see the trial in a particular behavioral condition and epoch. Yeah. And I will now let this run, and I want you to notice that probably you will notice that as soon as here the behavioral condition is changing, the pattern will change. So yeah, there are more than one are occurring per trial, so to say. Yet another one, yeah, a different behavioral condition. Yet another. Yet another. So what we typically find is that there is a high behavioral specificity. Yeah. This is what I want to show here, and that you saw it by your own eyes. So typically within one epoch, we don't have more than one pattern type. Yeah. And we don't have in all the epochs a pattern, but the patterns are specific to the behavioral context. Yeah, this I want to claim here. Okay. Yeah.
How variable are those when you compare them with the population?
So we allowed here 5 milliseconds for each spike.
Yeah, but it's really clear that we have the same pattern in a particular condition. I mean, if they were just.
Yeah, I found this also quite reassuring, I must say. Yeah, but there are more interesting things coming up, which is, yeah, what I also wanted to illustrate to you is, now if you look, I hope this was the same session, but what I once did is I noticed, I wrote here down the neuron IDs being active in a certain behavioral condition, what were the lags and how often they occurred. And what I then noticed is, for example, if you look at 38.1, this is occurring in different behavioral conditions. The same neuron in different behavioral conditions. Actually, this reminded me on a statement by Wolf Singer many years ago, where he said that neurons multiplex their assembly membership. This is what you see here, yeah, which I find quite interesting. Yeah, but this is even going a bit further. Yeah, so if this implies that these patterns have an overlap. Yeah, I don't know which we were looking at just now, maybe this one. So you see here different colors, and these contain 2 neurons. And this is just illustrating their, so to say, like a Venn diagram, the overlap of the patterns in terms of neurons. Yeah. And when you look at this from the very many sessions, almost all of them are connected, or there's a tendency that these patterns are connected. Yeah. This not so much, this also not so much, there is an isolated one. But in tendency, they are connected. I do not yet know what this means. Yeah. Or in other illustration, which I find also quite interesting, if this were all the neurons recorded, this is a small group with overlapping members. Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
Where this pattern had any particular time dependence on the onset of the different behavior, or were they just happening throughout that state?
During the epoch.
Like if you do a PSDH incidents.
No, they were not aligned.
They were not aligned, but they can occur.
They were not aligned. Okay. Now you may say, yeah, well, maybe they are clustering in space, in probability space. So again, here a display where you see now on the Utah array, which is 4 by 4 millimeters, and the yellow ones indicate electrodes where neurons were reported that occurred in patterns. They do not cluster in space. Okay, this is motor cortex. Yeah, motor cortex doesn't have such a how should I say, orientation tuning map or something like this. Yeah, but still, it's not the proximity of the neurons. Yeah. Okay. So a lot to digest. Now I want to come to an intermediate summary before I continue how this could be modeled. Yeah. So what this is, so to say, the summary statistics across all the 20 sessions regarding the pattern size. This you saw approximately before. They have multiple memberships in up to 9 patterns. Yeah. The group legs are distributed like this, and their spatial distances are also not preferred. I think this is an outlier because the statistics is getting rarer and rarer the larger the distances on the Utah array. So I find, despite the massive downsampling of the Utah array, and a rather conservative statistical analysis, we find these spatial temporal patterns. People would have neglected them. Yeah, they said, no, why should this be? And the neuron is not precise enough, and there are the firing rates changing, and why should you see something like this? Spatial temporal patterns are specific to the behavior, as you saw. The neurons do not cluster in cortical space, and individual neurons often participate in multiple patterns. They could be hubs, they could be whatever. Or in other words, neurons multiplex their assembly membership. What do I mean by this? That different assemblies are activated in the different epochs. Otherwise, the patterns would not have been different. This is, so to say, the interpretation. And the neurons which reappear in different patterns must be part of different assemblies. So far, so good. Okay. Now, I had a number of questions which led me to start with some modeling. For example, can the pattern statistics be explained by a Simfire-like model? Or if you have me a different suggestion, tell me. And if downsampling of neurons is done as in the experiments, yeah, and is one synfire chain enough? And we have submitted this. This you can find in bioRxiv. We have submitted this work to PLOS CB half a year ago. They seem to find no reviewers. Yeah, what should you do? Okay, so we approach these questions now. Now I briefly want to repeat what a synfire chain is. The expert on this sits here in the room. A synfire chain is in its basic sense groups of neurons, several groups of neurons, which are connected by a high divergence. So this is projecting in the most extensive case to any neuron in the next group. And this to all of them, meaning that these neurons in the second group have a high receive a high convergence, all in a similar way. And what Marcus showed in his PhD, or even before, that if you stimulate now such a chain, this is now per group is one box. You see that there is synchronous activity appearing, and this is propagating through this network. There are conditions when this is not surviving. This is the case here. Yeah. For example, if there were not enough neurons in the individual groups, there was a limit of 80 or so, or if the stimulation was not narrow enough in time. But in principle, he showed that there is an attractor where, so to say, even if these individual synchronous activities are more spread in time, they tend to synchronize again and run into this attractor. So it's a stable phenomenon, given the connectivity. Yeah. Now let's assume when you record from this, how does this relate to the spatial temporal patterns? Now, if you record, for example, this neuron, or this and this neuron and this neuron, then this would appear in your recordings as a spatial temporal pattern if this is activated again and again. Yeah. Okay. So, oops. Sorry. So what we did an anatomical model, not yet a dynamical model, an anatomical model where we had a number of assumptions then for the dynamics, and I will tell you about. So we assume this is, so to say, the particle space we want to fill with neurons. This is the 4x4 multi-array. You see here the individual electrodes placed on of this multi-array. And this below, there is are a lot of neurons, and they have a density of 35,000 neurons per cubic millimeter in this area. And what we now do is we embed synfire chains into this by selecting, for example, W neurons within a radius of R group, which is shown here. And then we select from these neurons which are there in this network, and you see them now illustrated, and then define them as a first group, and the starting point was random. And then we draw a center position of the next group within a Gaussian distribution with a standard deviation of this size. These will then be parameters of the model, and so on until L groups are placed. Yeah, this looks approximately like this. It's somehow moving in space. This is the kind of experiment we are doing. So we place them. We have, so to say, the electrodes as recording sites. And what we will do is we will record which neurons do we observe and assume the following. Successive groups are connected all between groups. First group is synchronously stimulated. So this is, so to say, the assumptions which we have in the back of our mind, and also based on the on the work of Marcus. What we expect to happen dynamically. First group synchronously stimulated, synchronous spiking activity propagates through the chain in the group time delay of 5 milliseconds. The neurons recorded if they are within a reach of 50 micrometer radius of electrodes, or in other words, typically, and this we took from the experiment, 1.1 neurons detected per electrode. This we took from our experiment. And one experiment, as I said, is the placement and recording from one chain. Statistics is then across the experiments. And then we have to define, what do we define as a synfire chain? When is it detectable? Well, it is detectable if at least 2 neurons from one chain from 2 different groups are recorded. Yeah? And now we, so to say, make our experiment. Oops. And you can, for example, vary different kind of parameters at a time, or later on we will do this together. So we vary the number of groups, we vary the number of neurons per group, we vary the size, the radius of the groups, the intergroup distance, the sensitivity of the electrode, and the density of the neurons. But basically what you see, the more groups we have, the higher the detectability, the more neurons involved, the higher the detectability. These 2 aspects are not very relevant. And if the group distance is increasing, the detectability shrinks. This is probably because they go out of the array, yeah. And also the density of the neurons has not so much effect. Now we, so to say, have run a lot of these simulations, but look at the combined parameter sets. And now this is a bit of crazy display. You have, so to say, on each of the axes, you have 2 parameters changing in parallel. You have the group distance here in the inner part and the group sizes, 500, 900, 1300, and so on. And here we have the width, that the number of neurons per group varied, and the number of groups. And doing many experiments per combination. And then what we did as a criterion, whether this is good or not, we compared this. Basically, I go one step further, but then go back. We compared, so to say, our experimental data to the model finding. Yeah. Oops. And so we computed this for each of the parameter combinations and found, so to say, that we basically calculated the similarity to this statistic histograms, what we got from the experimental data. And this has the least distance. So I showed you then the result in the next step. But you can also see that there are different ones which have a very close distance to the experimental data. But basically we found an optimum for 24 groups, very large number of neurons in the groups, radius pretty large, so it has the unit missing micrometers, and the intergroup distance of 500. And this leads, as I just showed you, to these results. These are now the histograms of the model and of the experiment for the pattern size, the multiple membership, group lengths, and spatial distances. What I did not tell you yet is, in order to have a multiple membership, we also should, in one experiment, embed multiple synfire chains. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. Otherwise, you would, so to say, always get the same pattern. So I would conclude on this point You can explain the data by synfire chains. Do you agree? Oh, what's that? And I want to show you still, because it's still not, I must say, I tried to visualize this for myself, and I want to show this for you, to you as well, what this basically means. So for example, these are now supposed to be a group with the radius we got out. Yeah, it's huge compared to the Utah area. And we got out, we should take 24 groups with a very small offset. So if these were, so to say, the successive groups, they are basically always everywhere on the array. Yeah. So this could very well explain why the neurons participating in the synfire chains do not cluster in space. Yeah. This is one consequence in some sense. Another thing I wanted to show, because this is probably not so easy to realize. Now I show you how I imagine that this is, so to say, the dynamics is happening, but there are not so many groups as now. So let's assume the first group is active, then the next, then the next, then the next, then the next, then the next. And basically, now looking with the eyes of Utah arrays onto it. Yeah, so I realized that this visualization is a bit misleading, because which would I now consider to have recorded, and we realized that we record only very little of, so to say, the first group, but the one who is, so to say, covering the most of the window. But just to get an impression of this. That you, yeah. So you look at me as if this would be stupid, but I tried to do this for myself to get a bit an idea of how would this actually look like, because it looks a bit weird, yeah, and that yeah.
On your real data, when you show the Utah array spatial distribution, did you see such a kind of a moving wave of synfire change? Looks, I mean, which will be similar to what you're visualizing.
Yeah, that's a good point. No, we didn't do this. I just did this a few days ago, but it's a good point. We more had something else in mind. We had the idea, maybe this is related to these cortical waves of the local field potential. But the waves are smaller than, so we also know the waves on this, and we have now projects of trying to bring this together. But waves are not as large. You really see the waves. Yeah. Let me come to the end, then we can discuss again. Yeah.
In order to explain the patterns, you cannot constrain the synfire chain further than a random network.
Random?
So
no.
the members of a group can be anywhere.
Yeah.
4x4.
Yeah.
And the groups also have a very large overlap.
Yeah. But this does not mean random network.
No.
The connectivity is still exact. Yeah. Yeah. So this is the summary I wanted to make, and then I show you again another option. Yeah. Another illustration. Experimentally found spatial temporal pattern statistics is explained by a model of multiple synfire chains. The number of isolated single units per electrode was relevant. multiple embedded synfire chains are required to match the multiple membership of STP neurons. A subsampling of 110 out of 840,000 neurons in recording volume is still allows you to observe spatial sample patterns. And there is an optimal match, wide and long synfire chains with many neurons per group. And what we next need to do is to have a dynamical model, whether this is stable. Yeah, is this really stable in a network where we have activity and so on? But there are good indications because there was this paper by Trenkov et al., where he had a spiking neuronal network model of so many groups, more than 50,000, and in each neuron was in about 70 chains, and this was still stable. If you want to use the data analysis tool, it's available in Elephant, a tool we developed. And now I would like to show you another way how this could be implemented. For sure, you have heard about polysymphony, or by Itzigevich or other people called this earlier on synfire braids. This is again a synfire chain. But what I now, the constraint I now relax is that delay from one group to the next is identical. I take this neuron a bit out. So its temporal relationship changes. But as long as this neuron gets its input synchronous, so do different delays and so on, it's still a propagating chain. And in extreme, this could simply look like this. Yeah. So, and I find this is in a way, I'm not sure if I bring this together yet, but this is more than what we saw somehow. Yeah. Although our delays were assumed to be constant from one group to the next. Just wanted to show this to you and then thank my people who work with me and yeah, help me to do this kind of things. Thank you very much to you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Now we have a little bit of time for the discussion. So,
thank you so very much. Interesting. I have a comment and a concern. So,
Okay.
I think it makes sense that you find Gruen like a small percentage. Otherwise, you will have a excision going on. It's good that you find very few units engaging better. But the question is that if you have like any plans to apply this analysis considering the fighting rate, I'm just thinking that for this type of task, so it's very well characterized what Pedro said, like the fighting rate increased. So it's a single factor. So taking my head to one point, you'll see very clear like the increasing fighting rate. Everyone contributes to that more or less. But it seems to be like the patterns will be happening constantly in certain periods. So like integrating probably with the fighting rate. I know the question is that could you integrate neurons with taking into consideration fighting rate to account for this? You know, like I would not expect it to happen in periods, but also expect it to happen like in relation to the behavioral events that you're looking at.
So what we did is, what is the overall firing rate of a neuron, of the neurons, and marked the ones which were in patterns. They had, so to say, the tendency to have a higher firing rate. Must be somehow, because otherwise we didn't have enough spikes for the patterns, right? There was this tendency, I observed that, yeah. More than that, I don't know. So what would you want to know more precisely? So maybe I can show you one or the other figure.
Just that if it is
No.
well observed that this happens, like the filing rate, just this it's like a single event happening around the behavioral event. So I was expect those, if those are related to the behavioral event as well. And I was expecting also to happen during that spike of the brain, or not spike, during the increase of filing rate. That's the question.
So
Or more likely to happen in that particular tiny window where the filing rate actually is changing.
not only. We saw this before, because the firing rates are typically changing during the movement. Yeah, but we basically, let me go back to this. Computer is a bit overwhelmed. No, come on. You saw this in this statistics here. These are the different periods, and here is during the movement. Yeah. So you see that they also occur in different epochs, also here. And this during movement is typically the large firing rate change. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the report. I'm just wondering if these multiplexing neurons or which are engaged have any particular feature like waveform or I don't know, it's fine variability or something that makes it special for this neuron.
Up to now, we didn't find anything.
Okay.
The only thing what I noticed by eye, my impression was, but this is a bit, I don't know how to characterize this, that often spikes in a pattern are also in a small burst. Should I run it again? But more than that, we tried everything. Yeah. What we did not yet do is, I agree, this we did not yet do is to look whether these are excitatory or inhibitory neurons. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking in the waveform, for example, if there are something.
Not so. If we would characterize the excitatory inhibitory, then we would go along the wave shape, the width of the wave shape.
But you have the whole data.
We have the data. We can do this. Yeah. Yeah, I need to tell this to Alessandra that she's still doing that.
And another question that I have is, what about the rest of the neuron that usually never get involved in that? So it's like it comes in dark matter in the brain. So it's useful need for that or no?
I can pose a wild speculation, which I have in the back of my head. All neurons are involved in synaptic chains. You just don't see them because you don't know in what they are involved. Yeah. And even more provocative, a firing rate of a neuron is the involvement in different chains.
So you have to imagine that the huge array, it looks organized, this 10 by 10 unit of electrodes, but you can imagine that it's just shifted by some microns, and then you get a completely different picture.
Yeah, also there's so much going on all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a similar question that was but because you will, of course, this cortex will be involved in many things. And this particular task is just one.
Yeah.
But I don't like the idea that in one task you have these three neurons, and another task you have another three.
Why not? These are not only these three neurons. There are many neurons. As I just see a signature of that.
It was exactly exploiting this massive number of neurons by distinguishing this overlapping parts of sequences, yeah? So that you could distinguish two sequences, although they have many parts that are exactly equivalent.
Yeah, I have the same mission. Usually when you report something, you always have a percentage of nothing. For some correlation with data, well, nothing, or even the animals moving or something like that. Okay, I have the idea that there are a percentage of some of that. I don't know, it's a baseline fine rate probably necessary for increase the growth, you can discharge it another again for maintenance or whatever. Yeah, there's something in some way it's a good noise or a necessary noise. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, people look at this, what we see from this larger room. Yeah.
Yeah, you only see a very small.
Yeah,
And I concede that. I mean, I have no problem with that. I think that it's a very beautiful way to look at it. I have other questions. I have other questions, but I mean, that there's two questions that kind of bother for experimentalists. Is the behavioral relationship. That's what I asked at the beginning. If these are involved in somehow the behavior, if they're relevant for behavior, you would expect that they would have particular times that happen, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So maybe they're conveying one kind of thing that is important for the behavior, but not particularly related to the change that is involved in what we see as behavior, like rapid moving, preparing, and so on.
I did not look yet. This is yet another thing that we should do, to look at whether there is a relationship of the latency of the pattern to the reaction time.
Okay, that quickly.
Yeah.
That I agree. Actually, now we're seeing that the shape of a response to a stimulus is very much linked to the response time. That if it's very nice, you have a short response time. If it's not very nice, the both potential, the response time is. So that may be a very good insight. The other question I had, it's always something I got when I talk about synchrony or pattern in this case, is that I could never get an idea of how much is the excess patterns, meaning that you have 100 patterns, but only 3 of them are excess, or they're 1 pattern and 3 are excess. You know what I mean? I mean, because you're extracting the statistics, but the network is blind to the excess. It sees all the pattern occurrences. So are these a large, small percentage? I don't know. This is something that I think we need to try to give an idea.
Yeah, I'm thinking of
so when you do it artificially, you embed a number of patterns because you know how many you put in there.
So there are so many patterns occurring. These are millions, yeah, in general. And we pick those out which are reappearing often. More often than expected, given the rate.
Right, but they will happen anyway. But so you increase the rate, and more patterns like this will emerge as the rate goes up.
Yeah, yeah.
But the excess is like twice as much, only 5% as many.
Much less.
Or I don't know whether I'm expressing myself.
I'm not sure, but out of whatever, 1 million or 10 million neurons there are, these are the ones you see, what I told you.
Right.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or so.
I'm not sure that question is, do I need patterns to become significant if the rate is higher? Then the answer is yes, because you have something like a distribution of number of occurrences, yeah, and if the mean is increasing, then also the width is increasing. So the right, yeah,
no.
But if you think about information processing, yeah, then of course you need to come up with a model where all the spikes in a pattern are contributing to the information processing, not only the significant ones, right? Because the brain doesn't know which ones are the significant.
That's the point.
It doesn't matter.
So if the brain cannot distinguish which are the significant and the not significant, if the significance are only 1% of the occurrences of the significance, the brain cannot ignore the non-significant.
There's no way. The significance measure is only for us to convince ourselves that there are patterns for the brain. It's completely irrelevant.
But it's not. Because the non-significant will cause synchrony and firing and things. Yeah, sorry. Sorry, is there any online question? Are you still there?
I do. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So it's Christian actually, but hey, thank you, Sonia, for this super nice talk. I was wondering if you guys looked at noise correlations in the data. So whether noise correlations would actually be predictive of changes in your sort of spatio-temporal patterns that you observed. Because there's this paper that came out not too long ago from the Luca Mazzucato group. They were collaborating with Zachary Mainen, where they actually analyzed data from rats that do sequential tasks. Doesn't really matter what it was. The way they modeled it is as sequences of attractor networks. And the way they moved from one attractor to another was embedding a Horstan-Uhlenbeck process, so like correlated noise, basically. That would sometimes be high enough to allow from one attractor to go to another, right? And the correlated noise was actually sufficient to grasp a lot of the summary statistics they could get in the data. So I was wondering whether you guys also looked at something like that, whether there was some form of temporal pattern in correlated noise that would be predictive of the spatial temporal patterns that you observed.
Yeah, interesting question. So this, what you call correlated noise, is basically correlated firing rates, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yes, so I would not expect this, but we need to test. I didn't do it. Good point.
And then maybe another question I had was whether if you guys also looked at like qualitative patterns in neural trajectories, like some form of dimensional reduction of the data, and looking at, like, for instance, the first PCs as a function of time, and whether basically you could get the behavioral patterns would look like qualitatively similar in those neural trajectories. So my point is that it seems like if I look at what you guys have done, is that those spatial temporal patterns, they are like some form of cyclic attractors in a subspace of the network. So do you think of it like that as well?
Could be possible, but cyclic, this means it should occur again at the right time during behavior.
Yeah, exactly, because you guys, that's my point. So you guys have actually, you don't have the similar timing between the motifs, right? The motifs sometimes happen, sometimes they don't happen, and so forth. But if you have correlated noise, you can actually have a variability in those timing, or even with private noise. So that's why I was wondering whether the timing of the motifs have specific patterns, and whether maybe sometimes it could be explained by private noise, or maybe more by correlated noise.
What is a private noise?
Private noise is Gaussian noise.
But private in relation to non-correlated, what do you mean by this?
So it's the way that you model noise, basically. So if you have, for instance, your equation, like your stochastic differential equation to model like a rate code neuron, private noise would be that the noise is Gaussian, like you selected from a random variable, and correlated noise, it would actually be, for instance, a Horst-Uhlenbeck process, where actually it depends on the previous amount of noise, right? So in that sense, that's why I was wondering whether you guys analyze also the temporality of the motifs, whether they have a specific, distribution.
No, we didn't. No, we didn't.
Sonia, what you did in the speech about it, I remember that you did this dimensionality reduction, and you could show that the different conditions, that you could distinguish the different conditions by trajectories. Right, or do I understand?
Yeah, right.
But you have not yet projected
Yes.
the patterns on the trajectories.
Yes, you are right. We could try to do this. Good point. Thanks for the question.
No, you're welcome. Super cool talk, and I love this talk because they actually open more questions than they answer, because it's so many questions that come up in mine, and the data is awesome. So nice work. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian.
You're welcome.
We're running out of time, so I would like to thank Sonia. Also, I would like to thank the people that came in this time of the year, which normally the number drops down, and the people that is with us online. Thank you, Christian, and the others who've been there.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.